Whacking weeds with a laser beam. It's not science fiction.
New Zealand plant biologist has made a laser that can precision kill targeted weeds using artificial intelligence.
That's crazy, right? It's almost like Terminator levels of technology.
Kia ora, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the Map and Zap, a new AgResearch device aimed at reducing the use of herbicides in New Zealand and the problem that's so vast that we will never get on top of it.
It's very overwhelming. We have so many weeds, many that are marching along the landscape rapidly.
They simply stop the native ecosystem in its tracks.
That's Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment Simon Upton raising the alarm in a 2021 report, warning that if exotic plants are left to their own devices, they will transform our ecosystems beyond recognition. He called for the government to lift its game in protecting native ecosystems from the thousands of exotic plants spreading across Aotearoa.
There are only 2,300 native plants in New Zealand, but there's over 25,000 exotics. And we've got nearly 2,000 out there self-sustaining in the wilds already. And some of those are problems. And most people have heard of something like old man's beard, and people have probably more recently heard about conifers. But there's a much wider suite of plants which, one way or another, if they get loose in our forests, in our high country, they can strangle and they can simply take over.
The statistics on weeds are staggering. They cost the agriculture sector alone a conservative estimate of $1.7 billion each year. Here's AgResearch Principal Scientist Dr. Graham Bordeaux on some of the impacts.
A weed, in my definition, is simply a plant that impacts negatively in some way on some human endeavour, So it's just a plant interferes with human activity in some way. So in agriculture, the plants we call weeds are those that reduce the yield and quality and sometimes the marketability of crops and pastures and grazing animals. In a wheat crop, for example, weeds, if you leave them in there, they will compete for water and light with the crop and reduce its yield and potentially make the crop so low yielding that it's not worth growing. Sometimes weeds and crops, if they're still there at harvest time, they make it impossible to harvest the crop. For example, in cereals in Canterbury, if you have green, weedy material still in the crop at harvest time, you have to delay the harvest so that the crop can dry out sufficiently to enable it to be harvested, or you have to dry the grain later at an increased cost. So there's all those sorts of impacts, reducing yield and quality of our crops and pastures and grazing animals. Chilean needlegrass, for example, it's got these very sharp drilling seeds that drill straight through the fleeces, in through the skin and into the muscles, underlying muscles of animals. So they ruin the pelts become useless because they're full of holes. The muscles have got abscesses due to the seeds, so that the meat is downgraded. The animal has health issues during its life because it might be blinded by the seeds. So it's just another example of an impact.
Until now, we've pretty much relied on herbicides to try and control them, but that's not going to cut it into the future. They're not good for the environment long term. Weeds are becoming resistant to their chemicals, and that's before we even get to the health issues linked to people using them. So we're looking at other ways to kill invasive plants. Map and Zap, still in development and looking for private money to commercialise it, is one of those other ways. This is the scientist who developed it, Dr. Kumar Gaka from AgResearch, speaking to RNZ's 9 to Noon.
It uses precision laser targeting for weeds, which is guided by intelligent AI, or artificial intelligence, that identifies weeds at species level. And it basically cooks the weed up from inside. So there's no chance for the weed to come back.
I was involved in the Map and Zap program with Kumars, It certainly is a novel way of controlling weeds. The idea is you map the species from the air with a camera mounted on a drone, and that same drone may also be carrying a laser, which can fire a shot at weed and kill it. So that's the basic idea, map and zap. And I think the idea has potential in certain areas of weed management. Particularly perhaps in natural environments where you've got very difficult access sites, say down bluffs. We have people abseiling down to dig out some plants. I can imagine map and zap being a potentially a much safer replacement for that method of weed control. Whether it would become mainstream for managing weeds, say, in a crop or a new pasture is another matter. In those situations, we're talking potentially about hundreds, if not thousands, of weed plants per square metre, and just how the map and zap technology would work effectively and cost effectively under those circumstances is yet to be determined. But it's an interesting and novel idea. Of course, having drones flying around firing off lasers will be an issue for the public of New Zealand, I guess, and there would have to be proper regulations around the use of that technology, and I don't think we've even begun to those sorts of regulatory issues.
I mean, I can just see the Peter Jackson film coming out where a drone with a laser attached cuts a cow in half, and there's a bloody
exactly,
result.
Exactly. Or the software doesn't quite recognise the target weed, and it actually shoots the farmer's wife.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all those sorts of issues. But I know the program that Kumars was involved in, the Map and Zap program, which was a 3-year MB Smart Idea project. We did look at a range of different types of lasers, and some are safer than others. But I think they can all cause fires. So there are certainly some technical and safety issues around the technology, but nevertheless, it's an interesting and novel way to manage some weeds, I think. And the mapping part of it itself is potentially hugely valuable, particularly for finding weeds, say in hill country where, for example, plants like Narcella tussock and Chilean needlegrass and other species that are quite rare in the landscape. And the real cost in managing them is actually finding them and getting to them.
At the moment, it sounds like it could be quite a niche tool, and that also that there's quite a lot of development to be done before it's very effective.
Yeah, before it's commercially available. Yes, I think that would be fair to say.
Attach it to a tractor or a robot or, I guess, anything that moves. And right now it does seem to work quite slowly. The aim is to speed it up. But it goes along and it maps the ground, and it can tell from, as soon as, I think, 2 leaves on a plant, whether it's beneficial or problematic, and whether it needs to cook it with a laser or not. But I've seen a video of it going, and it's pretty impressive.
Andrew Bevan's been covering this story for Newsroom.
Yeah, so weeds cost New Zealand, I mean, the running figure is just shy of $1.7 billion a year, but we know that it's just not correct, and the number is higher than that. I mean, that's a number that looks at a very narrow set of plants and very narrow set of costs. Loss of productivity is one thing. I mean, giant buttercup is a pretty common agricultural pest in New Zealand. So that grows on pasture land, and it's got some toxins in it that aren't digestible by dairy cows, and severely lowers productivity on farms where it is present or prevalent. You've also just got competing for resources, nutrients, all sorts.
Until now, we've tried to attack all manner of weeds with herbicides, but Andrew says New Zealanders' love affair with Roundup must cease.
I mean, it works really well. No one's pretending that it doesn't. But there is a risk that as we use it more, it will work less. I mean, weeds are amazing plants. And the more we use it, the ones that will survive, there will be a selection where weeds become more and more resistant to popular herbicides, pesticides, whatever we're spraying, to the point where these systems we're using don't work anymore, or at least don't work as well as we need them to. And, you can probably think about that in the same terms of, antibiotic resistant bacteria that we're sort of finding these superbugs in hospitals. I think when herbicides like glyphosate first arrived on the scene, they were sort of these wonder chemicals, in that you could kill weeds and sort of new growth without having to sort of till the land, release carbon, and sort of degrade the soil. But what we now know is that they're pretty indiscriminate, and there are weeds that we want to keep, there are weeds that we want to kill. And you've also, you've got fungi, mycelium in the soil, you've got worms, you've got insects. And that sort of biosphere is so important for agriculture.
And are we sort of learning now much more about both the importance to the biosphere and the dangers of the chemicals?
Yeah, we are. And I think dangers from the chemicals is kind of the key piece there. And the verdict is still out on whether glyphosate causes cancer. The World Health Organization says it potentially causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And, scientists are sort of on both sides of the fence on this. But, there have been hundreds of thousands. I think in 2020 alone, there was 100,000, just shy of 100,000 lawsuits in the United States over use of glyphosate, which is used in Roundup, which I think is a household name. And I think there's also just changing consumer attitudes, and that increasingly people don't want food that has had this sort of heavy chemical touch, rightly or wrongly.
Do we know how much herbicide use there is in New Zealand?
We have no idea.
Really?
It sounds crazy, but we have no idea. I mean, I went to the Environmental Protection Authority on this just the other day, and I got sent a resource from 2004 on the usage of herbicide in New Zealand.
20 years ago.
Which is 20 years. That's pretty crazy considering the environmental impact that herbicides, pesticides, and other sort of hazardous chemicals can have.
Well, what are we doing about it?
Yeah, so that's all changing now. So from 2026, companies will have to report how much, the quantity of hazardous chemicals that they're bringing into the country or manufacturing inside New Zealand. So that'll give us a pretty decent idea on usage. There may be some holes on sort of where and how, but it will fill a void.
So that's not just herbicides, that's other, like lead and paint.
Pesticides, fumigants, lead and paint, anti-fouling paint that's used on boats to stop barnacles and algae from growing. A pretty wide range. I think maybe explosives are also brought into this. But we're the only country in the OECD, so basically the only developed country that doesn't keep a record, which is pretty nuts.
Dr. Margaret Stanley is an ecologist at the School of Biological Sciences at Auckland University. She looks at how humans impact on ecosystems. She points out that these days very little in the way of plant matter gets through New Zealand's borders, but it's too late. The damage has been done.
We've got a lot of environmental weeds in New Zealand, and the problem is within the country. So we don't really allow new species of plants in unless someone puts a good case for it now, since we've had the Has No Act from 1990. But we've got about 25,000 introduced plant species in New Zealand. So compare that with about just over 2,000 native plant species, another just over 2,000 exotic or introduced species that are now breeding in the wild. And now we've got this big pool of about 25,000 introduced species that are in people's gardens and botanic gardens and horticulture, forestry. And every year, another 20 of those species start breeding in the wild. So what we call jumping the garden fence. So they breed in the wild, and then every year some of those become new environmental weeds. So we're sitting about 350 environmental weed species at the moment, and it's growing.
How do they jump the fence? Is this people doing their own weeding at home and then tossing them into the reserve next door, that kind of thing?
Yeah, really, it's just the fact that we have them there. Plants have the traits to escape themselves. So yes, some people are dumping weed clippings, not paying for those green bins, and dumping them in little bush fragments, which is absolute nightmare. They certainly can establish well from that. But then we've just got a whole lot of species that can have seeds that can blow in the wind, and the classic one is moth plant for that, so it's never going to stay in your backyard. And then we've got lots of species like Taiwanese cherry that the birds feed on and disperse. So bird dispersed fruit are really tricky ones. We love to have birds in our garden, but then they're always taking those seeds outside of people's gardens. So multiple ways for once you plant them in your garden, that's really the point at which we kind of need to be doing something, putting the right species in our gardens.
Some community groups do good work trying to limit the damage from one particular plant. Moth plant's an example. But Margaret says while that's good, we need more attention on emerging problems.
While we focused on these kind of weeds that have sort of gone past, they're well past the point of eradicating them, all we're trying to do is protect really high value areas. We can't control them everywhere. But while we're doing that, sometimes we forget about these new emerging weeds that have just jumped the fence, and that we can get on and try and control and eradicate and stop them being these widespread weeds that we're stuck with now.
New Zealand is doing globally groundbreaking tech work, something that predicts which of these thousands of exotic species will be the next to jump the fence and become our future gorse or California thistle or wilding pine. I'll let Graham Bordeaux explain.
This will be a global first. It's not quite AI, but AI might eventually be involved in estimating the parameters. But at the moment, we've just written code that does that for us. There's three parameters. There's the climate adjustment parameter. There's a parameter that counts the number of occurrences of the plant globally outside its native range. And then there's another parameter that counts the number of scientific publications about the plant as a weed. And so doing all of those things manually for more than a handful of species is impossible. But we can do it with code.
That data will be given to regional councils and the Department of Conservation and should be ready to go this time next year.
We scientists are really now looking for alternatives to synthetic chemistry. I mean, the synthetic chemistry we have is, in many instances, very good and not really environmentally damaging. It's cost effective, but protecting that chemistry in the long run by avoiding herbicide resistance is something that we need to be doing, and that is really what's driving our research to look for alternatives to synthetic chemistry. We're not doing that because we're saying synthetic chemistry is something we need to move away from. What we need to do is protect those great chemicals that we have. We don't want to lose them to resistance, so we need to find alternatives so that farmers have got a bigger toolbox basically to use to rotate different types of control measures so they don't have to rely on the same chemistry.
One farmer who is part of a trial of something different is Stu Lowe. Now, he owns a 380-hectare sheep and beef farm in the Scargill Valley in North Canterbury. One of his big issues has been California thistle, which thrives on the fertile land there.
We have fertile paddocks that's where and when you're turning paddocks over and trying to get some new grasses in, the kellies always sort of come away, and then once they get established, they start choking out your grasses, and then become a problem for stock grazing in amongst them, and then you get especially in sheep, you get or young lambs, you get a thing called scabby mouth. And as they eat, they get prickles in their lips, and it becomes scab, and it's like a cold sore basically, and and it really affects them.
And they don't know to stay away from it.
No, like they're hungry, so there's some clover in amongst those thistles, and they're eating the clover, but they're getting pricked by the thistles, which is
How much has it run away on your farm? Like, do you know what percentage of the farm is covered in it?
It's not as bad. You can't see anything at the moment. It's a summer weed. Yeah, the height of summer, probably January, February, that they're the most problematic. And that's when you know you've got a problem. I'd probably have maybe in its worst time 5% of my arable land has got Californian thistles on it. If you haven't worked the ground, you haven't opened it up, the Californian thistles don't tend to get in, don't get established.
In spraying the thistles, Stu was also taking out the good grasses like clover that he was trying to plant, and he also risked endangering local vineyards with those chemicals. You can mow the thistles back, but that's weather dependent and they can come back thicker. It was enough of a problem that when there was a meeting of farmers willing to try a new way of keeping the thistle down, using the leaf-eating tortoise beetle, he put his hand up.
And then they came and did a bit of a trial, put up pretty much a glass house over a bad patch of where my Californian thistles were or are, and released them. And basically, they couldn't go anywhere apart from get attached to the thistles there. And then we've come back. It was probably 6 months ago, and we've still got them, and they're chipping away. It's not going to happen overnight, but I am seeing reduced numbers where we have released them. Yeah.
So it's making a dent?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. After how many years?
It's probably 10. I haven't sprayed any herbicides to take out thistles for probably 15 to 20 years, I wouldn't have thought, yeah.
Did you worry initially that they could leap to another part of the farm and do some damage to things they shouldn't have been damaging?
Well, that was a question that was brought up at the field days, and they said no, they've come from Europe, and there's no predators here for them. But what else will they eat? And they said, well, they will just keep on thistles. That's their preferred diet.
So they're basically like the pandas of the thistle world.
Yeah, that's all they eat.
Meanwhile, Margaret Stanley says people need to start thinking about weeds the way we're thinking about predators.
Very little money in New Zealand is actually spent on weed control, which is really why it's out of control. And the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment released a report 3 years ago, really kind of worrying report about the lack of coherent management of environmental weeds in New Zealand and the little investment we put in it. And they really are the poor cousin to predator-free 2050 at the moment, where we're spending a lot of money, and people are really hyper aware of possums and, rats and things that you can see cause immediate death to birds. But often we have this, what we call plant blindness, where you just see green. You don't actually know it's a weed, and you can't kind of see immediate death of a bird, but in actual fact that weed is removing all the resources for the birds and completely smothering the habitat. So I think it's really hard for people to understand the impact of weeds because it's really slow compared to immediate death of a bird by a stoat or a possum or a rat or something.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Rangi Powick and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Stu Lowe, Doctors Margaret Stanley and Graham Bordeaux, and Andrew Bevan. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.